Hey, everybody, welcome to the newest installment of Stark Contrast. I'm Nick, I'm here with Malik, and we're going to be discussing the latest, I guess you could say, installments in the MCU. We're going to be talking about Black Widow for the first half, and then we're going to transition into talking about season one of Loki. And these are two things that I'm sure we're going to have a lot to say about, and, I don't know if you want to open us up with Black Widow since we're doing that one first, because you mentioned earlier that you've never dreaded talking about a Marvel movie this much. And,
Uh,
oof.
just because I know most people like this movie.
Well, I'm not sure about that because you likened this one sort of to Captain Marvel, and I don't know how much or how little necessarily that movie's fallen in your estimation, but I remember our discussion of that movie at the time being at least pretty like not overly negative. And I've actually seen a lot of people be kind of dismissive of this movie, and I was going to speak to that when it was my turn. So I don't think you have to worry about that too much, honestly.
Okay. Well, you know me. I was not in the camp that thought necessarily that this movie had nothing to offer because the character's already dead.
Yeah, same.
Um, at the same time, I think they had a very uphill battle in justifying the existence of this movie post her already being dead. And for me, I don't think they gave us an interesting enough story and look into her backstory for this to really be all that worthwhile. And even more frustrating than that is this movie is, to me anyway, very disappointing as a spy thriller. And I, I really, and you know me, I also say you got to judge the movie for what it is rather than what you want it to be. Had a real hard time doing that with this.
Hmm.
Um, I did not want another, as much as I defend Marvel, I did not want another run of the mill, a bunch of jokes Marvel movie with a kind of mediocre plot, serviceable plot, and some solid character moments here and there. But for me, like hardly any of the humor worked and felt out of place. Like I really wanted this to be like an actual proper spy movie, and they have the nerve to reference Bond, and Bond, like specifically with Daniel Craig's rendition, there's some borderline cheeky one-liners here and there. And there is levity to be found in those movies, but they're not. They don't feel the need to go out of their way to make the audience laugh constantly, like this movie was. And it was a lot of that was just super cringe to me. And Yelena being played by Florence Pugh, as I said in one of my posts when I posted about this movie, she is simultaneously the best thing and the worst thing about this movie because a lot of that cheesy forced humor comes from her, and it doesn't even come from a character place because when we start this movie, um, she's been mind controlled for years, and the second she falls out of that, she's doing the whole cheeky sassy sister thing when she hasn't been a person for years, and she should be way more like Bucky, subdued and quiet, but she's quirky. She's got this sass to her, and I'm like, where does this even come from? She hasn't been a functioning human being for years. She's just been an assassin drone.
Yeah, that's definitely, I'm gonna say just to that, getting that out of the way immediately, I can't justify that. I can't excuse that, and yet it doesn't bother me. Like, you're absolutely right, and that is a problem, and I have no defense for it, but I don't know what to say beyond I don't mind.
She's so good, it's almost excusable. But it's this was really not the movie to be trying to hammering in a bunch of jokes, and that just made it all the worse for me. I did not care
Yeah.
for the running gag about Black Widow posing and being called a poser. Like, we I didn't find it funny in the first place, but like they ran that joke into the ground.
That's one of those things where I liked the first one and I liked the ending one, and the middle one felt really forced. But in regards to, I don't know if you want to talk about anything else more generally before I sort of give my general thoughts or what.
Um, Overall, I was very disappointed with this film. I really wanted it to at least feel like I get a bigger understanding and appreciation for this character, and it really did not do that for me. And I mean, I don't. I'm going to touch on Taskmaster really quick. We can get into the nitty gritty.
Mm.
Just for me, I'll say I don't necessarily hate that they went off comics with Taskmaster. I just for how he's used, it's just kind of it doesn't like his involvement doesn't even really match the movie that they made because Taskmaster is this big, bright, colorful uh, character with this shining armor, and they've got him in charge of Black Ops missions that are supposed to be low key, and he's chasing after Black Widow and Yelena in broad daylight just because we need an action scene. Um, yeah, that doesn't. But you know, overall, I was disappointed in the film and was hoping for something a lot better than what we ended up getting. Um, but my absolute favorite thing about this movie, are the opening credits because we never do that in Marvel movies.
Yes, I was so happy to have an opening credit sequence.
Yeah, we never get that. They always do like closing credits, but I'm like, people are walking out of the theater. No one's even looking at this. Like, so all the time and effort you go into making that look, creative and cool. Like, no one really cares because the movie's over and they're leaving, or they're just tapping their foot waiting for the post credit scene.
Wait, sorry about that. I got traffic outside. But yeah, I think not even just Marvel movies, movies in general, the fact that we've kind of abandoned opening credit scenes just, I don't know, in the past 10, 20 years is really a shame to me because whenever we do it, it always is, it makes me happy. It's a cool thing to see a movie do. But
Yeah,
yeah.
like maybe studios are worried about wasted run time, but I don't
Yeah,
know,
but
just
I
don't make
mean,
it too overly long. Like
yeah, and I mean, you're
you can pull
basically,
off cool credits in like 2 minutes.
yeah, and like they have the credit sequence at the end, just move it from the end to the beginning. But anyway, so to sort of give my general thoughts, and there's a lot that's already been touched on that I'll circle back to. I really liked this movie a lot. I mentioned in my the video I did for it on my channel. I saw this with my sister Eden and my friend Brianna, and Brianna's been really low on the MCU lately, and we were all really surprised when we came out of this. And like Eden loved it so much, and Brianna has it as her new number one MCU movie. I'm not quite that hot on it. I'm really not sure where I would place this in a ranking. I haven't really given any thought to that, but I really enjoyed it. And I think for me, the thing that carries all of it is that I really do like the backstory and the arc for Natasha and just the central narrative. And I think that really is quite strong and it manages to cover a lot of things that I don't think work. And like I suppose because Taskmaster ties into that so heavily, I'll give my thoughts on Taskmaster, which is that I have zero investment in Taskmaster in any medium. Like I don't care about them in the comics. I really don't care about them anywhere. Like they're just kind of a thing that I'm aware of. Like the most I'm invested in them is when I used to play Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and they had this kind of big boisterous personality and I thought that was fun. But over time and like through the years that we've seen them show up like in say some Spider-Man cartoons or in the Spider-Man video game or in the Avengers game, we've used him pretty generically, and it's not really a character that anyone seems to have a solid take on that's really interesting or worth getting all that. in a tizzy over. So I'm sort of like you in that I really don't mind that this movie took that character, that name, basically, and used them for something kind of unprecedented. And like again, keeping in mind, I'm not really thinking about it in terms of, oh, this is Taskmaster. This is like a bright, colorful villain. I really think the way that they're used in this movie is really, really smart. And what we do with them really informs the arc and the central story of the movie in a really interesting, like tragic, engaging way. So I really had zero complaints with Taskmaster in this movie. To the humor, again, like I said earlier, I really can't justify the way that Yelena is characterized because you're absolutely right. But just in terms of the tone of the movie and is the humor too much, I don't think we go too far with her. I think ignoring the way it reflects on her character, like the ratio of comedic moments that we get from her isn't too much. And again, like you compared, because of the Bond comparison, like the Daniel Craig movies, I definitely think there's a lot of influence from other eras of Bond in this movie as opposed to Daniel Craig. Like when we get to the end here, it's definitely very Moonraker ish. But yeah, how goofy and how intentionally jokey James Bond is at any time seems to vary from era to era, and it could definitely get into that too goofy place sometimes. But I think Yelena is fine for the most part. The where I think the comedy goes overboard, and my biggest single problem with the movie is Alexei, and I feel like we're like the odd men out on this one because I know you don't care for how Alexi's implemented either. We seem to be the only ones. Everyone else seems to adore him and wants him in everything. And I'm like, okay, I guess like most people are
Like
sort of,
David Harbour is, he's got personality and he's doing his best Russian impression, but like that character's useless
yeah, and
in
like
this
I
movie.
take that as that's the people who are more judging on entertainment value than they are like the story or how consistent is the tone and like okay he's the most entertaining part of the cast, I guess that's true, but he's also he's you're right, he's useless for the plot. Like really you could excise him from this movie and the structure and like the skeleton of the story wouldn't have to be changed at all. And it's just it's weird that he's not he doesn't feel human the way that everyone else does. He feels like a cartoon character.
Yeah, he does feel like a cartoon character traipsing around with them.
Yeah, and it's a
And like
shame.
and then we have to make a joke out of the one big character thing that they tried doing with him, which is reconciling with his, daughters. And nope, that has to be a joke. He's not actually talking to them.
Yeah, and it's like we get that moment in the middle where he's singing American Pie, and like that is a moment where it starts off as a big joke, and then it's like it. The problem is that he just can't communicate, and like that is a place to derive humor from. But by the end, when we're doing the thing of like he's trying to get his feelings out there, and it's like you're not even wearing an earpiece. It's like okay, I didn't need that. And the problem I have most of all is that on paper, I think there's aspects to that and like his character and that conflict that works and like could really work. And it doesn't even it could work enough to justify him not being relevant to the plot, but we don't it feels wrong just in the way it's executed. Because what's kind of thematically appropriate about him being the one who's like the useless one and dismissed by everyone else is that he really is separate from them in a way that would naturally be difficult to reconcile. Where like imagine being Natasha or Yelena and the last time you saw this guy, he was pretending to be this pillar of strength for you and telling you everything would be okay, and the next time you see him, he's just this massive disappointment. And so getting us into their heads is like they're just so let down by this guy is I think a good way to justify playing him for comedy a bit. But then you're right, the problem is by the end we have to resolve that and we don't resolve it really.
Nope, we just keep doing more jokes.
Yeah. And like I wish, and I know that people would probably get mad, especially like the big reactionary YouTube people will get mad if we made this part of the text, but I think it's interesting in the subtext the fact that he's the only man among three ladies kind of informs the dynamic because he never suffered this massive dehumanizing trauma that the other three did. So there's an idea here. There's something in the way that he's characterized where there's this big buffer between him and them, and that's that they all experienced some version of the Black Widow program and he didn't. And they're all like they all got forced to do these terrible things, whereas Alexei wants to be doing those things. Like he's mad that he didn't get to be sent into the field and be like the top dog in like their operation. And he's like, "Oh, it was so boring. I wish I could be part of the action. I'm so proud of you girls for all the people that you've killed." And that's the way that the other characters react to that, and they're kind of really put off by him is interesting. And I just wish we brought it full circle somehow.
Yeah, that definitely could have been expanded upon more.
Yeah. But yeah, I beyond that, like he's my big issue with the movie. And outside of that, it's a lot of little things and I really don't even think it's that many. But like I really find a lot to enjoy with this one. So I spoke a little bit to Taskmaster. Well, yeah, because I talked about Taskmaster and sort of like how they carry into the arc. I think you're right in one sense about I suppose this movie justifying its existence. I'm not really someone who necessarily believes that this movie had to justify its existence beyond being a decent Black Widow movie. And when I say I liked the arc and the narrative that they gave us and how Taskmaster ties into it, uh, and I suppose we didn't give the spoiler warning, but it's a spoiler in the title. You guys know spoilers are coming. But when we get to the reveal with Taskmaster at the end, and it's Dreykov's daughter, I really, really like that idea because making the blowing up of Dreykov's daughter and thinking that she killed Dreykov into like the inciting incident for this whole story really is a really smart move. Because if this movie, and I do think that this movie kind of fails to implement the backstory in a way that necessarily strengthens Natasha's other appearances, but I do think in the context of this film just by itself, I think it's really good because we have this setup where they were this fake family and Natasha kind of without meaning to left everybody stuck in the system that she got out of. And I love that bit in the dinner scene where Yelena's like, "You got out. Dreykov made sure nobody else could escape. Are you gonna say anything? Like, did you think about this at all? Where did you think I was all this time?" And it's that she blew up this kid to blow up the man who abused her, and that in and of itself was bad enough and like a big chunk of red in her ledger. But also, it didn't work. Dreykov was alive. Like she didn't double check, and then she went on to try and redeem herself while everyone else was still stuck under the same abusive figure that was controlling her. And so making this a really interesting redemption story for Nat about a thing she didn't realize she needed to redeem herself for, and like how that ties into her family is, I think that's really interesting.
Um, and maybe it's just me, but I had this thought while watching it. I felt like a lot of that was well, not her like setting up the bomb is kind of a cop out. Um, because
In the
We know that
flashback, you mean?
Natasha was an assassin that worked for the Red Room, killed people. But the movie doesn't have the balls to show our hero actually killing anyone. When we know that's been our history, we've been told that. Up till this point, we've never actually been showed her doing it. Even in Avengers, when Hawkeye was possessed, like they showed our one of our heroes actually killing people. And for someone like Natasha, who's done that damn near countless times, um, allegedly, I think it would have been really powerful for them to follow through and actually show her doing assassination missions like they have Winter Soldier.
So you mean like they should have shown like Dracoff being like like a target of a assassination rather than like a bomb?
Well, that's tricky because then you have the thing of, well, how did they think that they physically killed him? Like,
Yeah, and also
get
how
away
do
with
you
that?
then
A bomb and like not being able to go back and check the rubble is an easier excuse than, oh, I shot him or stabbed him at point blank range and he somehow survived.
yeah, and if they did that, they'd also have to contrive a way to make the daughter collateral.
I don't even necessarily mean with that scenario, but just the fact that the movie very clearly does not, like, we want to keep making a point of her past and the red in her ledger, but we're showing this one token event which she was tangentially related to, like the attempted murder of Dracoff and his daughter.
Well, I
Um,
didn't take that as tangential. I took that as she was the one who made that happen.
well,
Orders from
well,
Shield,
she's
granted,
she's
but
there to
still.
get confirmation. She's sitting in a. She's not even. She doesn't even have her finger on the trigger. She's just there to be like, "Yep, he's here. Do it." You know what I mean? Like we don't
I
actually
really,
see her committing any acts
I,
herself.
I really feel like she's still completely culpable in that. Like being the one to give the all clear is as good as pressing the trigger.
I don't know. I'm just saying, like seeing her, like a little flashback of her actually doing missions pre Hawkeye. Um, and honestly, even after seeing this movie, um, I definitely still feel like that would have been the more interesting film, is to actually see her get recruited, and like because of that, I think would have actually given her relationship with Hawkeye like way more, I guess, substance for lack of a better term, because they've done so much showing or so much telling and not showing with that, like the big Budapest mission, and they're so close, and like a lot of that they just tell us. Like
Yeah,
we
that much
never
is
get to
true.
see any of it, so it a lot of the like that dynamic between them feels kind of hollow because all they do is talk about it.
Yeah, and at this point, I think we're getting into kind of the unfair shackle around this movie, which is that uh, Natasha has been stuck in supporting character role in other movies for contract reasons. So, like if this movie just came out in a vacuum, I don't think this would even be a factor. Of like, oh well, they could have told this story because that would strengthen other movies. And like I get the impulse to want that, and that is definitely something that that relationship could have used. But I also feel like it's maybe a little unfair to hold it against this movie for not being that.
You know,
Which I
that's
mean, you mentioned earlier already, like having a difficulty with getting past the what it is as opposed to what we want it to be thing. And I think a lot of people have that where whenever I do hear the criticism of like, why couldn't this movie have come out earlier? Or why was this the story they chose to tell? I think it's just because this character has spent so many years in a position where people are like, oh, well, I'd like to see this done, or I'd like to get some insight into this. And so this movie kind of had a, what's the word? And this isn't the word I'm looking for, but it kind of started with that handicap against it.
but yeah, pretty much everyone sans the actual Dracoff guy was good in the movie. Um,
Really, because I liked him too.
Uh, I don't know. He was just kind of there for me. And this movie also apes a lot of Jason Bourne in how it's shot and and the fighting and everything.
Uh,
And
I'll take your word for it.
I think also this movie in some scenes does not have that same attention to detail with the structure of like an actual spy thriller because we already so when she goes to Yelena's apartment, right? She's already made aware that Yelena is there before she even walks in. So all the tension is removed because we know who's fighting who. They're like she already knows that a single certain person is in the house, and then they fight really just because it's been a while since the movie had a fight scene.
Yeah, that's definitely the most forced fight in the movie. I could have done without it.
Yeah, it's a brilliantly choreographed fight, but
And like it
yeah,
makes
it's
sense from a character perspective. Like it makes sense that both of them would be really wary and might resort to violence, but I don't think it's there for a story reason.
yeah, especially because she just got unplugged. Not even didn't even know she was made the assumption she was unplugged. So you know
You're talking about Matt.
the way that scene should go is she walks in, Yelena, is that you? Puts her gun down, and then Yelena draws hers and attacks her.
Yeah, I don't know. There's ways that that could have been handled
Yeah,
better.
that could have been handled a lot better. But yeah, I think we've more or less covered this. So I'm ready to move on to Loki.
Well, okay. There were a couple of things I wanted to say still about like
Go ahead.
Dreykov stuff. Yeah. Again, just how I think the way that Dreykov is used really bolsters the whole story, which is I really think it's interesting the way that this movie talks about objectification and how Dreykov, I think to me, he leaves a really strong impression throughout the whole movie, despite having very little screen time and almost all of it at the end, because you can kind of feel his influence over everyone in the way that they interact with each other, especially Melina, because we haven't talked about Rachel Weisz's character at all. But the scene at her house when they're like around the dinner table, I could personally watch this movie a million times for that scene alone. I think that scene is great, and especially like you mentioned, Florence Pugh just killing it in that scene. And apropos nothing, I've heard a couple of people complain that this feels more like Yelena's movie than Natasha's, and I don't agree with that from a story perspective.
I don't agree with that either. I think Florence Pugh just steals the show, and
I
rightfully
think
so.
I think it's that, and I also think the camera maybe thinks it's Yelena's movie in some scenes because I was like, why do people think this way? And I'm like, I feel like it's because in a lot of scenes where we could be getting an emotional reaction shot from everyone, we're just getting it from Yelena. And like that's great because Florence Pugh's really selling those reactions, but it's also a little bit of a oh, I get it. This is probably a subconscious reason that people think of it as her movie because she gets a lot of camera focus in the big character scenes. But anyway, like that dinner scene is great. And it's this whole thing where Yelena and Natasha and Melina and Alexei all have this really interesting dynamic where, for one, I don't think the movie intended this at all, but I think there's a neat sort of accidental subtext with the fact that Natasha's the only one of the four of them who uses an American accent because it's kind of like the one person in an immigrant family who decided to fully assimilate. And that's literally what Natasha's done. Like she's assimilated away from the culture that they're a part of, that they're still stuck in. And you see, when you see that happen with families, there's this kind of simultaneous pride, but also bitterness. And you get that sense that like the other three are kind of happy for Natasha, but also really, really bitter at her for deviating from what they're stuck doing, and I think that's neat. But the way that everyone except for Nat really slips back into their old roles is, I think, really telling because she's the only one of the four of them who's meaningfully interacted with anyone else over the last 2 decades. And I think this would be emphasized even better if, like you said, we really characterized Yelena like that. Like if she was more subdued, or at least felt more like someone who hadn't really
Been a
socialized.
person for the past few years, yeah.
Yeah, like more than like being a person, like socialized with anybody. Because Yelena hasn't been herself; she's been brainwashed. Melina has been basically also brainwashed, not literally, but she's been forced to work under Dracoff and not really talk to anyone outside the Red Room. Alexi's spent so much time in prison, and we see from the little bit of the scene that we open with in prison, he doesn't really think about anyone but himself. Like, he acts for himself, he talks for himself. None of his interactions with anyone in the prison are meaningful. And it's interesting how this family unit functions because the only time that they're allowed to or allow themselves to properly perceive other people and not just objects is when they're all together. And the fact that they're all objectifying each other and objectifying people that they interact with on the daily, except for Natasha, is, I think, this kind of sinister little like, this is what Dracoff does, and this is what his influences turn these people into. And I think that's really interesting.
Um, I wanted to speak to like you did make some really strong points. I want to speak to the it was real to me thing
Yes, I
because I
love that.
don't think it's earned really. Like when Yelena says it, it is really like strong and emotional. Um, but then when we get the callback at the end, when Nat repeats it, I'm like, what changed exactly? Why do you suddenly think that that was real? Because you guys had a near death experience and your mom didn't betray you?
Well, I took it differently because of the way that, especially when it's just the two of them, that Natasha and Yelena interact. I get the sense that, like, Natasha is saying that because she wants to be done with this, but she doesn't even necessarily believe what she's saying. Like, in that bit when they're in the store where she's like, we were never family, and like she just says it so nonchalantly, and like that whole discussion where Yelena like, where did you think I was all this time? Natasha can't look at her, and like right after that, when Natasha decides to like fix up her arm, I think Natasha really does care about at least Yelena, and for her, at least that sisterly relationship was real. But she's trying to pretend that it wasn't because it's easier for her to just let go and move on.
Yeah, she doesn't want to feel the guilt.
Yeah, so that's how I took that. I took that
Okay.
as like when she sees Yelena like about to die, she's like, okay, I owe it to you to at least be emotionally honest. Like, no, I really do care about you.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Like if
Yeah,
there was ever bad acting in the MCU, that was it.
I think it's because it's such a quick thing, and it's also not helped by the fact that you can really see the green screen there more than anything
Yeah,
else in the
it's
movie.
bad.
Yeah, which is a shame. Like, it didn't take me out of it the way it did so many other people, but like, yeah, it's not good. But yes,
This was
now,
fun. No.
yeah, it's a bit much. But yes, now if you'd like to move on to Loki, we can do that.
Um. Yeah. Take it away.
Yeah, okay. So I think, like a lot of people, this was kind of the general sentiment that I'd heard, which is we didn't really have such an in-depth like sense of what this show was going to be before it came out, and a lot of people going off of the descriptions that we got of WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, this show, this one seemed on its face to be the less immediately engaging of the three. Like Wanda and Vision living in a sitcom. What's that about? That sounds weird. Um, the Sam having to inherit the mantle, like a black man becoming Captain America. That's a really loaded thing that I can't wait to see how we explore. Loki, what do we know about it? It's a show about Loki. Okay, well, I guess I guess I'll catch that. But immediately from jump, as soon as we find out what the actual premise of this show is, I'm hooked because it's so interesting on two main areas. One, it's it's like a full on exploration of existentialism, and it's doing that with the best character you could have done that with, because like the way we lay it out in episode 1, so much of Loki's role has been defined as the guy who's doomed to failure because he's the villain, because that's the way that we wrote him, because it's written into his character to be like a creature of habit. So making like a 6 episode Loki therapy session where we ask ourselves, can this guy change? Is he capable of really self actualizing? And we tie that question to the question of, what does it mean to have free will, and can anyone actually control who they are? Like we lay the stakes of those questions out in episode 1, and I'm really pleased to the degree that the show just goes all out and explores that. And yeah, I don't know, that's, no one really knew what this show was going to be, but I'm glad it's this.
Yeah, people have called it Marvel's Doctor Who. As someone who actually watches that show, how do you feel about that statement?
um I really don't see it, and there's a channel that I follow called
He's
Full
got the
Fat
jacket and
Video.
the tie and everything.
Yeah, I'll give it that. Loki does definitely have a doctorish dress sense, but there's a channel that I follow and who's really cool, Full Fat Videos, who did a video about this show as a counterpoint to Doctor Who, and like I can kind of see some of their points, but the most I get a Doctor Who vibe from this show is aesthetically. It's got some pretty decent Doctor Who vibes just in terms of the timey-wimey, spacey nature of the way it looks and sort of feels. And there are certain turns of phrase in the dialogue that feel like they belong in Doctor Who. Like when you get to, um, is it, yeah, it's the start of episode 4, and Sylvie's talking about spending her whole life at the end of 1,000 worlds, and it's like that's such a Doctor Who phrase, and like there's stuff like that sprinkled throughout the show, but structurally it's obviously not like Doctor Who. That's a very episodic show. Every episode is basically a new conflict, a new storyline, a new location, and yeah, I just don't quite get the vibe beyond kind of surface level trappings of anything Doctor Who-ish about this show.
Okay. Um, so for me, of all the Marvel shows they were making, this was the one I was least excited for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was coming from a place of, you killed this character, um, and you gave him a pretty satisfying conclusion in Endgame. Not Endgame, Infinity War. And then they went back on that in Infinity War, and I'm like, okay, we're clearly just doing this to set up that stupid show. And I did not like that. I was like, if death doesn't matter in your story, then why are you killing people? Like, it's just don't.
Mm.
Um, like, because for me, the time travel thing is a cop out. Like, it's not the Loki that died; it's this other Loki. Well, bringing that character back in any capacity, that's a cop out. That is you going back on what you initially did. Um, Now, having said that, I I did have a fair amount of fun with this show. Did not have the best first viewing of it because I was having a hard time. Well, I wasn't having a hard time with the initial like premise because I'd already accepted like they went back on the death, whatever. Let's just see if the story's good. But then I was in this place of, this Loki isn't acting like the one out of the first Avengers. Tom Hiddleston is still stuck in Thor Ragnarok kind of kind of place. Like he's still playing it like he's that Loki. Um, like from the get go, from the very beginning. He's not acting like the one that just murdered Coulson and is running that war and commanding the Chitauri. Like he is acting like the Loki that we've had, the one that died. And that was really distracting to me and made it really hard for me to be invested in anything that was going on. So I, I really did not like it. For first time. Well, it's fun to watch. I couldn't like really be invested and like it as a story because I'm like this just isn't not this is not that character. It's not you guys aren't playing him like he's that character. I mean, like you're telling me that he is, and you're even going as far as showing the flashbacks and everything. But that's I just don't buy it. Like I don't buy that this is that same Loki. For so much of the story, that's what kept me from really being engaged with it. Um, and I don't know what it was about the second viewing that made me kind of ease into that stuff a little better. It's still very much a problem. There's no getting around that. Like he's just not playing it like the Loki from that time. But I do really like his arc. I do like that we see him change. Well, scratch that. I would like it if I bought that this was the Loki they were telling me it is, but it does not feel like that Loki.
Mm.
Um, so it's weird for and then I made the mistake of actually going back and rewatching the first Thor and then Avengers before I watched Loki for the second time, and I'm like, oh, this really doesn't feel like that same guy. It just doesn't. Um, and for that guy to go to be acting like be acting in the way that he's acting and um Sylvie grows to change him like the whole him and Sylvie thing and that connection that they have worked better for me on a first viewing, honestly, having not gone back to the first Avengers or the first Thor. um but yeah, that stuff is sticky. And then the cutesy cop out of like when people get, what the heck is it called, purged or whatever.
Pruned. It
That's
pruned.
pruned. Yeah, that's not them dying. It's them being transported to another place so that they can then be killed by a ghost cloud or a monster cloud or whatever. Like, okay, more death cop out nonsense. Like, why are we even doing that? But um, yeah, I don't want to sound like the contrarian or the Debbie Downer or whatever, but just that's just how I feel. Like I had a lot of issues with this show, but ultimately was still pretty surprised in just how much I liked it. I really dig the score, especially the score for the opening title. Um, and it's wacky and a little zany and fun, but like people are acting like it's the weirdest. It's so weird. It's super weird. Like it's great that Marvel's doing this weird out of the box thing, and I'm like, uh, this is this really isn't. I mean, sure, it's fun and quirky, but it's really not. It's not even that weird. Like WandaVision was weirder, and like I've seen Doom Patrol and Umbrella Academy, and both of those shows are weirder.
Yeah,
But
I don't know that.
yeah, it's fine. It's good. I do like a lot of the character exploration stuff. Um, I just I can't really buy it the way they want me to buy it because for so much of this, I don't even buy that I'm looking at the Loki I'm supposed to be looking at.
Okay, so to speak directly to that problem, I think the issue here is manifold, as in like there's a lot of factors that go into this. One of them is that when I watch Avengers, I get the sense that that's Loki putting on a show. Like for almost every bit of screen time he has until we get to the point that he's like on his ass saying, "Okay, I'll have that drink now." Like he is playing like this much more intimidating, like much more formidable version of himself for reasons of his own ego. And it's all a facade. And I've always felt that about watching that movie. Like there's a real sense of artifice and like calculation to everything Loki says and does in that movie, and I think the other characters also pick up on it. So on the one hand, I think like Loki consistently being different to that movie in this show is just a matter of Avengers isn't really how he is. It's how he'd like to be in the context of that movie, but that's not the guy. Secondly, and this was the argument that I made to you at the time as we were only like a couple episodes in, is that I think it also speaks to the power of the TVA and like the intent of the show to be this complete character breakdown that they give him no room to put on any facades about himself. Like they pick him up practically as soon as the show begins. He's like thrust through this bureaucratic chain of like, all right, I don't even know what's happening, but do this, do this, do this, or you'll die. And he sees the guy right next to him get like killed for the slightest insubordination. So he's just going along with it. And then we sit him down in a room with Mobius and spend basically just like 20 minutes completely breaking his character down and like, really, who are you? Are you that guy in Avengers who just goes around killing people because it's fun? Like, what do you want? What do you actually want out of your life? Do you even know? And I really appreciate that episode going as far as it did with that and that conversation between the two of them. Because after that, I completely buy that Loki is a guy who's like, well, damn, I guess this whole conquest thing that I thought I wanted isn't actually going to fulfill me at all. Like, what actually do I want? Who even am I? What is my persona besides what I was just pretending to be earlier in Avengers? And I really buy that that conversation with Mobius gets him to that place, and that for the rest of the show, he's just a guy trying to figure himself out. He doesn't even know who he is, really. So I felt like that all worked. And the you mentioned like that in informing like the arc that he overtakes during the whole show and like the change that he has to go through. I think the change that Loki goes through in this show is one that he would need to go through even post Ragnarok, post Infinity War, because like
Like, sure,
when
he's still got his fairly duplicitous nature. Like, he does go as far as, taking the Infinity Stone or whatever in that movie, which, Thanos then takes from him in
yeah,
Infinity War. But,
and and like I mean beyond that, like he spends that entire movie double crossing people and like lying and trying to be duplicitous again, nominally for the sake of achieving some sense of power. And this whole show is about Loki, do you even want power? Would that actually make you happy? Like, that's the reason that you lie and hurt people because you think it's fun or because you think it'll advance you somehow. Do you actually care about those things? And I just think it's really interesting to have the show ask those questions and to have the answer at the end of the day probably be no. He doesn't want those things. He doesn't want to hurt or lie. He doesn't even know why he does it.
um, I do remember him saying he does a lot of it for attention.
Yeah, like he the bit with Sif in episode 4, which again is a bit I love, where we start that sequence with he's messed with her hair, which is actually a thing that Loki apparently did to Sif in Greek myth. So nice shout. But she comes in, beats him up, and his first reaction is, "I remember this. I did it. I had a laugh, and then I never thought about it again because it was just a bit of fun." And then it just keeps going on until eventually he's like, "Okay, I did it for attention because I'm a narcissist and I'm scared of being alone." And that's a really revelatory moment for him. Like, why does Loki do anything? Because he wants people to look at him and see him and acknowledge him because he's scared that if they're not doing that, then that means that he's by himself forever. And this whole show is like squaring, okay, that you can maybe, hopefully, not be alone without having to do those things.
Yeah, Odin basically pitted him up against Thor and all but said, only one of you is going to get the throne, and therefore only one of you is going to be of value.
Yeah. And like I made note of this in my video again. I think it's really interesting the way that Mobius sort of serves as an Odin proxy in this show, and we get to have a sort of more satisfying version of what I think we were trying to do with Odin and ultimately fumbled with. Where and we emphasize this when Loki's looking through those clips of the other movies, basically, and he sees Odin say "I love you," and that's like a big moment for him. But even bigger is having Mobius, someone who basically says what Odin says, which is, "You were meant to be one thing, and like this is what you are, this is your nature." And then by the end of episode 4, he's like, "I was wrong. You can be anything that you want to be, even someone good." And if Loki had heard something like that from Odin, that would have cleared up so much.
Um,
What
how do
was
you
it?
feel about uh, Sif? No, I said Sif.
Yes,
Um,
Sylvie.
Sylvie.
I think Sylvie as a character is really interesting. I think the relationship between the two of them has been the sticking point for basically everyone who watches this show. Like, even the most positive things I've heard about this show have acknowledged that, in what's probably a very intentional way, the Loki Sylvia relationship is very, very messy and very unorthodox and very strange, not just in the fact that they're two versions of the same people who love each other and that's weird, but also in the way that, like, in the way that we're used to seeing relationship arcs structured, it feels kind of lopsided, and that might be kind of the point. And I don't know, I think it's really interesting and really interesting to think and talk about, but I can't blame anyone if, like you, they say, like, in the process of watching it, it doesn't feel totally natural and it feels a bit forced. I think they're doing something really interesting with the two of them that is a high risk, high reward thing where the risk is this comes off really, really weird and unearned structurally.
Do you think they managed to pull that off?
I genuinely don't know because I've got
That's
this
kind of where I'm at
I've got
because
this weird feeling that like something's not quite as neat and like perfectly written, quote unquote, as it could be. And yet when I look at any of their scenes together, I really love every scene that they have and I have no complaints.
I really like that actress. I only know her from the small part that she had in Into the Badlands as Baji's ex-wife.
Hmm. I would not have recognized her.
Yeah, I recognized her immediately. Yeah, she's good in this show. Um, that I liked. So I've heard people both praise and kind of hate on the MCU for, or at least the writers of this show for making Loki bisexual in a conversation, um, but like not making a big deal out of it. Like I've seen some people get mad about it, like just have Loki say he's bisexual or whatever. Um, but I thought they handled that, as pretty, classy, just casual, and they just kept the story going.
Yeah, in that moment, I think because the thing is, I haven't seen a lot of people be mad about the handling of the bisexuality besides, people who will like very vigorously ship him and Mobius. What I have seen a lot of people be less hot on, which I think is pretty justified, is that discourse gets kind of tied in with the other thing, which is that they very subtly confirm, quote unquote, confirm Loki as gender fluid or like non-binary, where They have the little file on him. It's in the marketing, and it's also very briefly in an episode. In an episode where it's like Loki, like sex, gender fluid, and it's like, okay, that's interesting. But then we get to the penultimate episode of the show where it's Loki in a room full of male Lokis, and he's like, "Hey, have you guys ever met a woman version of us?" And they're all like, "Oh, sounds terrifying." It's like, that's maybe a little bit defeating the idea. Then, if you're gonna be like, "Hey, Loki's gender fluid now," that's kind of weird.
Yeah, that's. I didn't even know about that. I never I never noticed that file.
Yeah, I think it's episode two. It's either it's probably episode two, but there's a file that Loki's looking through about himself, and it's like Loki, the age, whatever, sex. It's just
Okay.
weird that if we're gonna announce that about the character, that like so much of the actual character interactions kind of goes against that idea.
Well, I mean, they didn't really announce that. That's there for you to see if you see it. But like, I didn't notice that, and the show doesn't actually make a big deal about that. So,
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
um, there's some other stuff I want to talk about. Um,
You
this
mentioned
this show
something.
is really ballsy only in its finale. In that, like, the crazy, like, just insane expo dump that they do at the end as a way to close off your final episode. Like, it's like, I mean, I'm not the guy that comes to these things just for the action, but I can't imagine your mainstream audience is going to appreciate this.
Well, I've seen very little, if any, complaints about that. Like I've seen almost nothing but universal praise, in particular for Jonathan Majors' performance. And the worst I've ever seen about this episode is people comparing it to the architect scene in The Matrix, and even then they're comparing it favorably. Like this is the better version of that setup.
I've seen a lot of people say that. Um, I've seen a number of people just dismiss the whole show as outright setup because of that finale.
Yeah, I think that's more of a plot thing, which is like it really does feel to a degree like once we end this show and it's like the multiverse is here. Oh no, what's going to happen? And we, the audience, already knowing that the multiverse is going to factor into presumably a lot of stories going forward, then that can't help but read like setup. And it's obviously like this show is getting another season, so like tune into season two for
And it's the only one that is. So I, and also, fittingly enough, I think it's the only show that can so far. Like, WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier are very much miniseries.
yeah,
Like, those should have been only one story things. You know, Falcon isn't Falcon anymore at the end of that show. He's Captain America.
yeah.
Um,
Like
and
the premise of those shows was not meant to. It was meant to be a story that we told in a finite amount of time.
yeah. Whereas I could see this going on for at least two more seasons. Well, I say that now that well, actually, no. Now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, we've reset it because the timeline's all out of whack. We don't know how Loki is going to factor in to
Yeah,
either of the movies, if
we don't
any.
even we don't even know if this is a reset or just a different one of multiple TVAs now. The writers and director have been very mum about answering that question specifically. So like we really have opened up a whole different status quo going forward. And it's interesting because there's not necessarily any reason from the outset that this had to be anything other than a miniseries also, because setting it up with Loki's character arc and how that ties into the TVA as like a fixture in the universe, you absolutely could resolve both of those things in 6 episodes if you wanted to. So I'm curious as to what more story they have to tell that made them go like, no, let's make this the one that continues on.
Um, what other thing that I want to mention?
There was something you mentioned earlier that I had a response to, and I forget what it was. Uh,
Maybe it'll come back up, but oh my god, I was literally just about to say it, but I wanted you to finish your point first.
oh boy, sorry.
Oh yeah, um, the best shot in this show is also the worst shot in this show. So you know that great long scene, like one take when
At
they're
the
in
end of episode 3.
yeah, the end of episode 3 was awesome. I was like, this is so cool. I love when shows and movies do long one takes like this. And then Loki is like, I got the building, and then just like reverts it or like pushes it away or whatever. And I'm like, since when the heck is he telekinetic, and why has he never used it before?
Yeah, that was really, really odd. I was like, huh,
Since
that's a
when in the
weird
heck
thing to
can
just
Loki
have.
do that?
It's a weird thing to just have happen and then not talk about. And like when we see other Lokis be like telekinetic and stuff and display different powers, I'm like, okay, we've already set the precedent that different Lokis, especially the variants, like learn different forms of magic. Okay, fine. But that was just this one self contained moment. It's very
And Loki's
strange.
never been able to do that.
Really weird.
If he's had like Wanda level telekinesis, why has he never used it? There should have been no reason he was smacked around by the Hulk if he has that.
Well, that's not necessarily true, but the point is he should have used it at some point.
But yeah, I the Matrix is also really interesting. So he's playing Kang. I don't think we're actually getting Kang until Ant-Man and the Wasp, or at least like him as a titular villain.
Yeah. And he's, again, I gotta agree with the crowd that's like, even with this episode basically being a massive exposition dump, his performance carries it really well. And I think part of what makes me say that is that I think I had the intended reaction to it initially, which is that I was really put off and thought it was really strange. And like, why is he making these choices? And the Infinity podcast, who I love to bring up all the time, had a really good point about just like the final episode of this show in the context of the entire MCU is probably deliberately the least charming, least polished acting from anyone who's ever been in one of these shows or movies. Like it's from Majors and Hiddleston, and I'm blanking on Sylvie's actress's name, but all three of them in that room are playing it very messy and very like real person emotional in a way that we don't see in a lot of stuff, and it really engages you in that scene that on paper is just a lot of info dumping.
Yeah, he's got some interesting like ticks and like he's just the way and the way he's always like moving, whether it's his face or his hands, or like he's always moving throughout that scene.
And like he mentioned in an interview that he called upon his previous experience being a clown for like the physicality and that stuff.
That's interesting. And I know him from Lovecraft Country. We both watched that, didn't we?
Yeah, he's in Lovecraft Country. He's in The Last Black Man in San Francisco. He's in something else, but it's a slip in my mind.
He's in a new Western Netflix movie that I really want to see with like a bunch of solid actors of color.
Hmm. Man, it's gonna bug me what else I know him from. But yeah, the Lovecraft Country I feel like is the biggest, like most high profile thing that he's been in recently. And like
And
he's
he was
really
pretty
good.
much the straight man in that. And here he's like this weird, quirky, interesting character.
Yeah. And the great thing about us establishing this whole variant thing, and like we're gonna see more of this guy, maybe not even just as Kang. We might get Kang plus even other different versions. It's like I can't wait to see him play the same person, but not at all the same person. And like we get just a little taste of that from Hiddleston and in this show where I really like the very, very brief look we get at President Loki, where, again, this is clearly Tom Hiddleston as Loki, but it is also a different Loki to who we've been watching for the past 6 episodes, and different to who he is in any of the movies. And like that's in the performance and the voice and the physicality, and it's for just a couple of minutes, but it's really neat.
Yeah, in the trailers, that was often the sting at the end of the trailers is what did you expect? And I'm like, why is he wearing a president sticker? Um,
And like I think a lot of us were expecting like a whole episode where Loki runs for president, and I still would have liked to see that, but keeping us on our toes.
um, I didn't really love the. It was cool to see that weird, like more classic comic booky Loki with like the long horns doing like glorious purpose, and like that was a cool moment.
Yeah,
But
classic Loki's great. It was great to get Richard E. Grant for that part.
it was, yeah.
And like it's good that he has a character arc over that episode. Like what makes him doing that and like the glorious purpose like really satisfying is that he has like a journey of going from sort of like resigned to the idea that every Loki is doomed for failure and inherently broken and will never be trustworthy, and is like, well, why do we do all these things to ourselves? We're all broken forever. And then he just has that one conversation with Mobius where it's like, why would you turn your back on this thing that you've dedicated your whole life to? And he just says it's never too late to change. And it's like, okay, I guess I can give myself some purpose. I don't have to be this way forever. It's like, it's really great. It's really neat.
And then we have to reward his newfound optimism with death.
I mean, hey, he died happy, which is better than a lot of Lokis get to say.
Yeah. Um, so I think ultimately this show, more so than any of the other shows, um, really impressed me in that it had a much steeper hill to climb because I
Mm,
wasn't excited for it. Didn't like that they were even doing it. Didn't like that the show even existed. I'm like, this is dumb. Why does this even exist? And then I had a lot of fun with it and came to enjoy the narrative and the story despite my um, hesitation.
yeah.
And I had, like I said, I still kind of have, um, or at least for that first viewing, I had that issue of not being able to buy that I'm looking at the Loki I'm supposed to be. And the second watch was easier, but in some ways even more frustrating because I had the movies in my head because I just went back and watched them. Um, but as its own thing, it stands as a pretty fun way to spend your time. I like the not weird, but I guess kind of zany, wacky adventure stuff, and um, the timeline thing. I don't know how much mileage we're gonna get out of that once we're finally done with multiverse because that's the big event we're building to.
But who
Um,
knows when we're going to be done with that is the thing. That could
yeah, I
be a
don't know.
long while.
Yeah, because I don't think what is our last movie in Phase 4?
Um, I don't know. Let me check real quick because we might not even be sure of that. Uh,
Because we get Eternals in November, then we get Spider Man in December.
we've got a lot of stuff still to come this year. Like we've got 2 more shows by the end of this year. So let's see.
We got Suicide Squad here in a couple weeks.
Um,
I can't even tell you how excited I am about that. Like that was probably my most anticipated comic book film this year.
yeah, we're really not sure when Phase 4 ends because the projects that have been announced after that like slate trailer, like we know we're getting a second season of this show, we're getting a show about Wakanda, we're getting a fourth Captain America movie. We don't know when that's coming, but as far as we know, the last thing that has like kind of a tentative release date is Fantastic Four, and that's only like we know it's coming sometime 2023. Oh, and then there's Blade, Fantastic Four and Blade, sometime 2023, and then after that we don't know what's up.
Okay, because I heard that Fantastic Four wasn't a Phase 4 movie.
It's listed under there for now, so
Okay.
we've got the stuff that we have, and then just as far as movies go, not including the shows, Spider Man, Doctor Strange, Thor, Black Panther, Ant Man and the Wasp, the Quantumania, Guardians 3, Fantastic Four, and Blade.
Okay. Um, I I do really want to tackle the Fear Street trilogy. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see the third movie yet. For
Yes,
the next time
I
that
have.
we do a stark contrast, um, that and honestly, Suicide Squad. Yeah, Suicide Squad.
Yeah. Brianna has gotten she's really into horror, so we've been watching a lot of spooky stuff together. We started watching on Netflix this thing called Slasher. It's interesting, but yeah. Anyway,
Oh, you actually like it?
I think I think it has problems, but it's definitely something that we enjoyed watching together and like talking about and thinking about.
Okay.
It's got Katie McGrath is the main character of the first season. So Lena from Supergirl.
Okay. Oh yeah, I know her. I'm gonna start that show myself. Because yeah, I could use a good horror show, and
Yes,
it Fear Street has definitely put me in the horror mood. I do want to start going back to a lot more horror stuff since I am a horror fan.
but
Um,
anyway, you can put this prior to all this conversation because I'm gonna say that's our thoughts on Loki. So thank you everybody for listening, and please let your own thoughts be known in the comments if you agree, disagree with us. Is there anything that you'd like to hear us talk about at some point on Start Contrast? We will take it into consideration. But for now, peace out.